January 1968. The rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy province drip with monsoon rain. A Viet Cong squad moves through the darkness at 3 miles per hour, shadowing an Australian patrol base. They've fought Americans for years, helicopters roaring in, artillery thunder. Then silence. The enemy retreats to their fire bases and lets the bombs do the talking. But these Australians are different. No engine noise, no radio chatter, just boot prints in the mud and the patient rustle of jungle fatigues. They move like ghosts at 2 miles per hour, setting ambushes that last for hours, tracking broken twigs like bloodhounds. One former Viet Cong commander would later say something that flips everything you think you know about this war. Worse than the Americans were the Australians. Not because of their firepower, not because of their numbers, but because they understood something about jungle warfare that turned the hunter into the hunted. The most dangerous enemy wasn't the one with the biggest guns. The morning of January 15, 1968, broke gray and humid over the rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy province. Sergeant An Tri crouched in the undergrowth 30 meters from a well-worn trail, his AK-47 balanced across his knees. The monsoon had turned the red earth to mud, and every footstep squelched. His 4-man team had been moving since midnight, infiltrating from their base camp in the Long High Hills toward the Australian stronghold at Nui Dat. The plan was textbook Viet Cong: hit fast, fade faster, let the terrain swallow them whole. Tri had learned this game fighting the Americans. The pattern was always the same. Contact meant helicopters within minutes, UH-1 screaming in at 110 miles per hour, disgorging infantry while phantom jets rolled overhead at 700 miles per hour. Then came the artillery, 105mm howitzers dropping high explosive from 11,000 meters away. The earth shook, the jungle burned, and the Americans declared victory over smoking craters. But by then, Tri and his men were already 3 kilometers away, melting back into villages that looked exactly like every other village in the Delta. The Australians, though, were proving different. Tri had first noticed it 3 months ago, during a supply run near Dat Do. His team had been crossing an open stretch of plantation when they heard it, or rather, didn't hear it. No helicopter blades, no radio static. Just the soft crunch of boots on dead leaves, maybe 200 meters behind them. When Tri looked back through his field glasses, he saw 8 soldiers in jungle fatigues moving at walking speed, weapons held low, stopping every few minutes to examine the ground. They moved like hunters, not like soldiers in a hurry to get home. Now, as dawn light filtered through the rubber trees, Tri positioned his men in an L-shaped ambush along the trail. This was the route the Australians used for their morning patrols. He'd been watching them for 2 weeks. They came out of their base at Nui Dat around 0500 hours, 8 to 10 men per patrol, moving northeast toward the village of Bin Ba. Unlike the Americans, who flew everywhere, these Australians walked. And unlike the Americans, who moved fast and loud, calling in coordinates over crackling radios, the Australians moved like they had all day. Tri's youngest soldier, barely 17, whispered that he could hear them coming. The boy had grown up in these plantations and could identify a footstep from 50 meters away. Tri listened. There it was, the methodical pace of combat boots on wet earth. No talking. No metal clicking against metal. Just disciplined movement through terrain that had swallowed whole companies of South Vietnamese regulars. The lead Australian appeared around a bend in the trail at 0715. Tri could see the man's face through the undergrowth, calm, alert, scanning left and right with the patience of someone who understood that survival meant taking time. Behind him came 7 more soldiers, spaced 5 meters apart, weapons ready but not rushed. They moved at roughly 2 miles per hour, stopping every 100 meters to listen. Tri had never seen Americans move this way. American patrols covered ground like they were late for an appointment. These Australians covered ground like they owned it. Tri raised his hand, signaling his men to hold fire. The range was perfect, 20 meters, but something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way the Australian point man kept his head on a swivel, eyes constantly moving, or maybe it was how the patrol's machine gunner had positioned himself to cover 2 different avenues of approach. These weren't teenagers from Ohio who'd been in country for 6 weeks. These were professionals who'd been thinking about this moment since before they left their base. The Australian patrol passed within 15 meters of Try's position. He could have killed three of them with his first burst, but his instincts screamed at him to wait. Something about their spacing, their movement, the way they kept visual contact with each other while still maintaining tactical formation. They weren't just walking through the jungle, they were reading it, processing every shadow and sound. Then the trap revealed itself. As the last Australian disappeared around another bend, Try heard movement to his left, movement that shouldn't have been there. Another patrol was paralleling the first one, moving through the plantation rows 50 meters away. While Try had been focused on the obvious target, a second team had been working a flanking route. If he'd opened fire, he would have been caught in a crossfire within seconds. Try held his breath and counted slowly to 100. When he finally moved, it was to signal a withdrawal. His team slipped deeper into the plantation, abandoning their carefully planned ambush. As they moved, Try realized that everything he thought he knew about fighting foreign soldiers had just been turned upside down. The Americans came with overwhelming force but predictable tactics. These Australians came with patience and unpredictability. They'd turned his own guerrilla methods against him. 3 hours later, safely back in their temporary camp, Try's men asked why he hadn't given the order to fire. He told them they'd been outmaneuvered, but privately, he was still working through what had happened. The Australians hadn't just avoided his ambush. They'd never been vulnerable to it in the first place. They'd walked into terrain that should have belonged to the Viet Cong and made it theirs through nothing more than discipline and tactical patience. That night, as rain drummed against his shelter, Try found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had with an older cadre who'd fought the French. The man had said that every enemy teaches you something, but only if you're smart enough to listen. The Americans had taught the Viet Cong to fear firepower and speed, but what were the Australians teaching them? As Try drifted off to sleep, he realized he was about to find out, and the lesson might be harder than anything the war had shown him so far. Lieutenant Colonel Bill Williams stood in the operations tent at Nui Dat Base, studying aerial photographs of Phuoc Tuy Province spread across a plywood table. The images showed 3,000 square kilometers of rubber plantations, rice paddies, and dense jungle that had become his responsibility when 1st Australian Task Force took over the province in April of 1966. Unlike his American counterparts who commanded brigades of 15,000 men, Williams had fewer than 8,000 Australians to secure an area the size of Rhode Island. The mathematics were simple. He couldn't win through numbers, so he'd have to win through method. The conventional approach to Vietnam had been written in American doctrine manuals and validated in Korean hills a decade earlier. Find the enemy, fix them in place with superior firepower, and destroy them with overwhelming force. A typical American operation began with intelligence reports processed through division headquarters, followed by helicopter insertions at 1,500 feet. UH-1. Iroquois helicopters flying at 110 miles per hour would deposit full companies into landing zones, supported by F-4 Phantom jets capable of 700 miles per hour at 30,000 feet altitude. When contact was made, the standard response was to break contact, call in coordinates for 105 millimeter howitzers with an 11,000 meter range, and let 500-pound bombs finish the job. Williams had seen this approach in action during joint operations with American forces in the Iron Triangle northeast of Saigon. The firepower was impressive, B-52 stratofortresses dropping ordnance from 30,000 feet, creating craters visible from orbit. But the enemy had adapted. Viet Cong units learned to break contact within minutes, disperse into terrain they'd known since childhood, and reassemble days later in areas already declared secure. The American style frightened the enemy but rarely destroyed them. It was warfare by appointment, and the enemy simply refused to show up. The Australians brought different ideas, forged in the rubber plantations of Malaya during the emergency of 1948 to 1960. Williams had spent 3 years hunting communist insurgents in terrain remarkably similar to Phuoc Tuy, dense jungle, ethnic Chinese populations, and an enemy who lived off the land and moved like smoke. The lesson from Malaya wasn't about firepower, it was about patience. Find the enemy's patterns, disrupt their routines, and stay in contact long enough to exploit their mistakes. Williams implemented this philosophy through small unit tactics that reversed American priorities. Instead of inserting companies by helicopter, he sent out patrols of 8 to 10 men who walked everywhere at 2 kilometers per hour. Instead of calling in immediate fire support, his men were trained to maintain contact and pursue fleeing enemies on foot. Instead of sweeping large areas quickly, they focused on smaller zones with methodical precision, returning to the same trails and villages day after day until they owned the tactical initiative. The results appeared in intelligence reports that told a different story than American operations. During Operation Bribey in February 1967, Australian forces lost 16 killed and 55 wounded in a week of intense fighting, but the engagement patterns showed something significant. Instead of brief contacts followed by enemy withdrawal, Australian patrols maintained contact for hours, forcing Viet Cong units to fight on Australian terms rather than their own. The enemy couldn't simply melt away when pursued by soldiers who moved at walking speed and showed no inclination to call in artillery strikes that would end the engagement. The weapon that made this possible wasn't technological, it was tactical discipline adapted to jungle conditions. Williams trained his platoon leaders to think like trackers rather than assault troops. A broken twig at eye level meant someone had passed within the last 6 hours. Fresh-cut bamboo indicated a recent camp. Bird calls that stopped abruptly suggested human movement ahead. His men learned to read rubber plantations the way ship captains read ocean currents, understanding that terrain 300 feet above sea level created drainage patterns that channeled enemy movement into predictable routes. The proof came in ambush statistics that reversed conventional wisdom about jungle warfare. A typical Australian ambush began at dawn, with 8 soldiers positioned in an L shape along known infiltration routes. They might wait 6 hours without moving, communicating only through hand signals, until Viet Cong columns appeared within 20-meter range. When they opened fire with L1A1 self-loading rifles and M60 machine guns, supported by 60mm mortars with a 2.5-kilometer range, they weren't calling in coordinates for distant gunners. They were finishing the job themselves. Sergeant Antri had told his political officer that Australian tactics created a different kind of fear among Viet Cong fighters. American operations were violent but temporary. Helicopters came and went. Artillery fell for 30 minutes, then stopped. The jungle returned to normal within hours. Australian pressure was constant and personal. Their patrols appeared on the same trails week after week, forcing the Viet Cong to abandon established routes and supply caches. Instead of controlling the tempo of engagement, Tree's men found themselves reacting to Australian initiatives. The strategic impact became visible in infiltration statistics compiled by province headquarters in Berea. Before Australian arrival, an estimated 200 Viet Cong fighters per month moved through Phuoc Tuy province from supply bases in Cambodia. By late 1967, that number had dropped to fewer than 140 per month, a 30% reduction achieved not through massive firepower, but through persistent small unit pressure. The Australians had built an 11-kilometer minefield from Dat Do to the coast, but the real barrier was tactical. Enemy fighters could no longer move freely through terrain they'd previously considered safe. Williams understood that his approach succeeded precisely because it contradicted American assumptions about modern warfare. Superior technology and overwhelming firepower were supposed to dominate irregular enemies. But in jungle terrain where visibility rarely extended beyond 50 meters, patient infantrymen with disciplined fire control often achieved better results than fast-moving mechanized units calling in airstrikes. The enemy learned to fear not the loudest weapons, but the quietest soldiers who refused to break contact until the tactical problem was solved on their terms. The morning of November the 23rd, 1967, found Corporal Dave Mitchell and 7 soldiers from B Company, 5th Royal Australian Regiment, lying motionless in the Hat Ditch region of western Phuoc Tuy province. They had been in position since 0450 hours, concealed among 30-foot rubber trees 200 meters from a jungle trail that intelligence reports identified as a primary infiltration route for the Viet Cong's 3rd Battalion. The trees provided perfect cover, thick enough to break up human silhouettes but sparse enough to allow clear fields of fire. Mitchell could smell the dampness of decomposing leaves and hear the morning sounds of insects beginning their daily chorus. Intelligence indicated that enemy forces used this particular trail to move supplies and personnel between their base camps in the Maytao Mountains and operational areas closer to the Australian base at Nui Dat. The pattern had been established through weeks of observation. Viet Cong columns typically moved during early morning hours when mist from the nearby Rai River reduced visibility and covered the sounds of movement. Unlike American units that might insert by helicopter and establish ambush positions for a few hours, Mitchell's patrol had walked 12 kilometers through the night and committed to staying in place until the tactical situation developed. At 0702 hours, Mitchell heard what he'd been trained to recognize, the soft rhythm of multiple footsteps moving in tactical formation. Through his binoculars, he counted 18 men in black pajamas and floppy hats, carrying AK-47 rifles and canvas packs. They moved in single file with 5-meter spacing, exactly as described in captured Viet Cong training manuals. The lead scout carried his weapon at port arms and stopped every 20 meters to scan the surrounding jungle. These weren't farmers pressed into service. These were experienced fighters who understood small unit movement in hostile territory. Mitchell waited until the enemy column had moved within 20 meters of his position before raising his hand to signal his men. The ambush had been planned as a classic L-shaped engagement, with Mitchell's section forming the base of the L along the trail, and his machine gunner positioned to deliver enfilade fire down the enemy's line of march. The key to success wasn't firepower, it was timing and fire discipline. Open too early, and the rear of the column would escape. Wait too long, and the lead elements might detect the ambush. The first burst came from Mitchell's L-101 self-loading rifle, a 7.62 millimeter round that dropped the enemy point man at 18 meters range. Immediately, his section opened fire in controlled bursts while Private Henderson's M60 machine gun raked the trail from the perpendicular position. The crossfire created a killing zone that trapped the entire enemy column within a 50-meter box with no covered avenues of escape. Within 15 seconds, Mitchell counted at least 6 Viet Cong down, with the survivors attempting to break contact by moving into the rubber plantation. Instead of calling in artillery support or requesting helicopter extraction, Mitchell made the decision that separated Australian tactics from American doctrine. He ordered his men to pursue the fleeing enemy on foot, maintaining contact through movement rather than firepower. The Australians had trained for this scenario, fighting through jungle terrain while maintaining unit cohesion and tactical advantage. They moved as hunters, not as conventional soldiers waiting for support weapons to solve the tactical problem. The pursuit lasted 40 minutes through dense undergrowth that reduced visibility to 10 meters. Mitchell's men used hand signals and predetermined rally points to coordinate their advance, while the surviving Viet Cong fighters attempted to establish defensive positions among the rubber trees. At 0815, Henderson called in a fire mission for 60mm mortars from their forward operating base, dropping 4 high-explosive rounds 200 meters behind the enemy position to cut off their withdrawal route. The mortars, with their 2.5-kilometer range, provided precise support without the collateral damage of larger artillery systems. By 0900 hours, resistance had ceased. Mitchell's patrol counted 12 enemy dead and captured 3 AK-47 rifles, 200 rounds of ammunition, and documents that intelligence later identified as communication schedules for Viet Cong units operating throughout western Phuoc Thuy. The Australian casualties were 0 killed, 1 soldier with minor shrapnel wounds from a grenade that detonated 30 meters away. The engagement had lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes, far longer than typical American contacts that averaged 15 minutes before breaking off to call in fire support. Sergeant An Tree had been 3 kilometers away when he heard the gunfire echoing through the plantation. By the time his reaction force reached the ambush site, the Australians had withdrawn, leaving only scattered equipment and blood trails that led deeper into the jungle. Try examined the tactical evidence with growing unease. The ambush had been perfectly executed, enemy movement predicted, killing zone established, pursuit maintained until tactical objectives were achieved. This wasn't the random violence of artillery and airstrikes. This was personal, professional warfare conducted by soldiers who understood jungle fighting as well as any Viet Cong unit. The intelligence impact of Mitchell's ambush extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Documents captured during the engagement revealed that Viet Cong 3rd Battalion was experiencing supply shortages due to Australian interdiction of their traditional infiltration routes. Radio intercepts indicated that enemy commanders were ordering longer detours around known patrol areas, adding days to movement schedules, and increasing vulnerability to detection. The cumulative effect was strategic. Australian small unit tactics were forcing the enemy to abandon terrain they'd controlled for years. 3 weeks later, similar ambushes in the Hat Ditch region resulted in what intelligence analysts called a significant degradation of enemy capabilities. Viet Cong infiltration rates through western Phuoc Tuy dropped by an additional 20%. Supply convoys began avoiding the area entirely, and prisoner interrogations revealed that Australian patrols had achieved something American firepower had not. They had made the enemy afraid to move through their own territory. The tactical success validated Lieutenant Colonel Williams' approach to jungle warfare. Patient observation, disciplined ambush techniques, and aggressive pursuit had proven more effective than search and destroy operations that relied on massive firepower. The enemy could survive artillery bombardments and airstrikes by dispersing and taking cover. They couldn't survive persistent pressure from small units that refused to break contact and maintain tactical initiative through superior fieldcraft and fire discipline. Mitchell's ambush became a template that Australian forces would repeat throughout Phuoc Tuy province, turning the hunter-hunted relationship that had defined guerrilla warfare in Vietnam completely upside down. The Battle of Bin Ba on June 6, 1969, began at dawn when Viet Cong sappers infiltrated the village and established fighting positions in concrete houses along the main street. Intelligence reports indicated that approximately 40 enemy fighters had moved into the town during the night, armed with AK-47 rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and enough ammunition for a sustained engagement. For the first time in months, the Viet Cong had abandoned their hit-and-run tactics and chosen to fight a conventional battle in terrain that favored defensive positions over mobility. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Conn, commanding officer of 5th Royal Australian Regiment, received the contact report at 0630 hours and made a decision that would demonstrate the full potential of Australian combined arms tactics. Instead of calling in immediate airstrikes or artillery bombardment that might level the village, Conn ordered a squadron, 4th Cavalry Regiment, to advance with their Centurion tanks, while 5th RAR Infantry provided close support. The Centurions, each weighing 51 tons and mounting a 20-pounder main gun, had arrived in Vietnam in December 1967 specifically for situations like this: urban fighting where precision mattered more than overwhelming firepower. The tactical challenge was complex. Bin Ba consisted of approximately 200 concrete and wooden structures arranged along 3 parallel streets, with the Viet Cong positioned to create interlocking fields of fire from second-story windows and rooftop positions. Traditional American doctrine would have called for massive preparatory fires to suppress enemy positions before infantry assault, but such an approach would have destroyed the village and killed civilian inhabitants who might still be trapped in their homes. Conn's alternative required tanks and infantry to work together at close range, clearing buildings one at a time while maintaining tactical coordination under direct fire. At 0745 hours, the 1st Centurion tank rounded the corner onto Bin Ba's main street and immediately took fire from 3 different positions. The 20-pounder gun responded with high-explosive shells that punched precise, holes in concrete walls without bringing down entire structures. Behind the tank, Australian infantrymen moved in tactical bounds, using the Centurion's bulk as mobile cover while identifying enemy firing positions for the tank's main gun. The coordination required split-second timing. Infantry had to mark targets quickly and take cover while the tank engaged, then move forward immediately to prevent Viet Cong fighters from repositioning. The engagement developed into a methodical advance that lasted 6 hours. Each building required individual clearance, with tanks providing direct fire support, while infantry searched rooms and eliminated remaining resistance. At 0915 hours, a rocket-propelled grenade fired from a second-story window struck the lead Centurion's frontal armor, creating sparks and noise but no penetration. The tank crew responded by putting a 20-pounder shell through the window, collapsing the upper floor and eliminating the RPG team. Australian casualties remained minimal because the combined arms approach allowed each element to support the other's weaknesses. Sergeant An Tree watched the battle from a concealed position 500 meters outside the village. He had expected the Australians to respond with their usual patient patrol tactics, perhaps surrounding Bin Ba and waiting for the Viet Cong to attempt withdrawal during darkness. Instead, he witnessed something that fundamentally challenged his understanding of Australian military capabilities. The tanks and infantry worked as a single organism, each supporting the other's advance in ways that eliminated tactical vulnerabilities. When infantry encountered strong resistance, tank guns provided immediate fire support. When tanks became vulnerable to close-range attack, infantry cleared nearby buildings and rooftops. By 1300 hours, resistance in Bin Ba had been systematically eliminated. Australian forces counted 1 soldier killed and 7 wounded, while Viet Cong casualties included 107 dead, 6 wounded, and 8 captured. The precision of the engagement was remarkable. Most village structures remained intact. Civilian casualties were minimal, and captured documents provided intelligence on Viet Cong plans throughout southern Phuoc Tuy province. The battle demonstrated that when Australians could concentrate their limited resources, they achieved tactical results that matched or exceeded larger American operations. The strategic implications, however, told a different story. Bin Ba represented one of the few occasions when Viet Cong forces chose to fight a conventional battle on terrain that favored Australian combined arms tactics. Most engagements still followed the pattern of brief contact, followed by enemy withdrawal into terrain where tanks couldn't follow and infantry had to rely on small unit tactics. The Australian method worked perfectly when the enemy cooperated by fighting on Australian terms. But the Abai broader war was being decided by factors beyond tactical excellence. Intelligence reports from late 1969 indicated that despite Australian tactical successes, Viet Cong supply lines from Cambodia and North Vietnam remained largely intact. The Ho Chi Minh Trail continued to deliver personnel and equipment to communist forces throughout South Vietnam, and political developments in the United States suggested that American commitment to the war was weakening. Australian Prime Minister John Gorton had already announced that his government was reviewing Australia's military involvement, responding to domestic political pressure and changing strategic assessments. Try understood these larger currents better than most Australian field commanders. While his local units had been forced to abandon established infiltration routes and supply caches, the overall communist strategy remained viable. The patient, methodical Australian approach had made Phuoc Tuy province more difficult to operate in, but it hadn't fundamentally altered the balance of forces in Southeast Asia. American public opinion was turning against the war, and Australian political support was following the same trajectory. By October 1970, the Australian government announced the beginning of a phased withdrawal from Vietnam. First Australian Task Force would be reduced from 8,000 to 4,500 men by the end of 1971, with complete withdrawal scheduled for 1973. The decision reflected political realities rather than military failure. Australian forces had achieved their tactical objectives in Phuoc Tuy province, but tactical success couldn't overcome strategic exhaustion in Allied capitals. Try realized that he had witnessed something historically significant but ultimately limited. The Australian method had proven superior to American tactics in jungle warfare, creating genuine fear among Viet Cong fighters who respected their professional competence. But even the most effective small unit tactics couldn't overcome the industrial-scale logistics supporting communist forces or the political dynamics that would eventually force all foreign troops to withdraw from Vietnam. The lesson was sobering. Tactical excellence without strategic sustainability was merely a postponement of inevitable political decisions made thousands of miles from the battlefield. 23 years after the last Australian helicopter lifted off from Nui Dat Base, An Tree stood in what had once been the operational heart of 1st Australian Task Force. The year was 1996, and the rubber plantations that had defined his war had been replaced by industrial developments and widened highways connecting Ho Chi Minh City to the coastal resort town of Vung Tau. Where Australian Centurion tanks had once rolled through Bin Ba, tourist buses now carried visitors to beaches that had been off-limits military zones during the conflict. The physical landscape bore little resemblance to the battlefield, where he had learned to fear the patient footsteps of Australian patrols. Tri had returned to Phuoc Tuy province as part of a Veterans Reconciliation Program organized by the Socialist Republic of Vietnam and the Australian government. The delegation included former soldiers from both sides, historians documenting the conflict, and family members seeking closure decades after the shooting stopped. At 68 years old, Tri walked slowly through the grounds where the Australian base had sprawled across several square kilometers, his memories triggered by terrain features that remained unchanged despite urban development surrounding them. The memorial at Long Tan had been built where D Company, 6th Royal Australian Regiment, had fought their famous battle on August 18, 1966. The simple concrete cross and bronze plaques recorded names of 18 Australians killed and 24 wounded during an engagement that lasted 2 hours and 30 minutes in a rubber plantation that looked remarkably similar to this location. Tri studied the memorial with the eye of a former combatant who understood small unit tactics and the decisive importance of terrain, weather, and timing in determining battlefield outcomes. Standing beside him was John Morrison, a 71-year-old former corporal from 5th Royal Australian Regiment who had served 3 tours in Phuoc Tuy province between 1967 and 1970. Morrison had volunteered for the Reconciliation Program after reading about similar initiatives between American and Vietnamese veterans. Their conversation began tentatively, conducted through an interpreter, but gradually developed into the kind of professional discussion that occurs between former soldiers who had faced similar challenges in the same terrain. Morrison described the Australian patrol techniques that had made such an impression on Tri during the war. The morning routine began at 0430 hours with equipment checks, map studies, and coordination with adjacent units. Patrols of 8 to 10 men would depart Nui Dat Base at 0500 hours, moving at 2 kilometers per hour through rubber plantations and secondary jungle toward predetermined objectives. Unlike American units that moved quickly to contact points and called in fire support, Australian patrols were designed to maintain contact through patient pursuit and superior fieldcraft. Tri acknowledged that these tactics had forced significant changes in Viet Cong operational methods. Traditional infiltration routes had been abandoned after repeated ambushes. Supply schedules were disrupted by persistent Australian pressure on known logistics nodes. Most importantly, the psychological impact of facing an enemy who refused to break contact and withdraw had created genuine apprehension among communist fighters who had grown accustomed to hit-and-run engagements with American forces. The conversation revealed details that military historians had never documented. Tri explained that Viet Cong regional commanders had issued specific warnings about Australian patrol methods as early as late 1966. Unlike Americans who could be avoided through tactical withdrawal, Australians had to be fought and defeated because they would not abandon contact voluntarily. This fundamental difference required communist units to carry more ammunition, accept higher casualty rates, and operate in smaller groups that were less vulnerable to sustained pursuit. Morrison shared intelligence assessments that had guided Australian tactical development. Captured documents indicated that Viet Cong infiltration through western Phuoc Tuy province had dropped by nearly 50% between 1966 and 1969, largely due to persistent small unit pressure rather than massive firepower demonstrations. Australian commanders had recognized that their limited resources required tactical methods that maximized effectiveness per soldier, rather than relying on industrial-scale logistics to overwhelm the enemy. Both men understood that their tactical engagement had been embedded within larger strategic dynamics that neither side could control. American public opinion had turned decisively against the war after the Tet Offensive of 1968, creating political pressure for withdrawal that no amount of tactical success could overcome. Australian involvement had been even more limited, reaching a peak of 8,000 soldiers in a conflict that eventually involved over 500,000 American personnel at its height. Tri revealed information that surprised Morrison and challenged conventional narratives about the war's conclusion. After Australian withdrawal in 1973, Viet Cong forces had required nearly 2 years to fully re-establish control over infiltration routes through Phuoc Tuy province. The tactical methods they had been forced to develop while fighting Australians, smaller unit sizes, more careful reconnaissance, longer approach marches to avoid detection, had become standard operating procedures that improved their effectiveness against South Vietnamese forces during the final campaigns of 1974 and 1975. The day concluded at the former site of Fire Support Base Coral, where Australian artillery had coordinated with infantry patrols to provide rapid response to contact reports throughout northern Phuoc Tuy. The base had been overrun by a coordinated North Vietnamese attack in May 1968, resulting in 25 Australian casualties, but had been reoccupied and expanded as a symbol of tactical resilience. Standing in the overgrown foundations, both veterans could visualize the defensive perimeter, artillery positions, and helicopter landing zones that had supported operations across several hundred square kilometers of contested territory. Morrison presented Tri with a copy of the official Australian battle honours that recognized unit achievements in Vietnam. The list included engagements that Tri remembered from the other side: Coral, Balmoral, Hat Dish, Bin Ba, battles where small tactical decisions had produced strategic consequences neither side had fully anticipated. Tri reciprocated by sharing excerpts from his own memoir, published in Vietnamese in 1995, which included the quote that had defined his assessment of Australian military capabilities: "We were more afraid of their style." The reconciliation concluded with a ceremony at the Long Tan Memorial where veterans from both sides placed flowers and observed a minute of silence. 60,000 Australians had served in Vietnam between 1962 and 1973, with 521 killed and over 3,000 wounded. The numbers represented a significant commitment for a nation of 12 million people, but the tactical lessons learned in Phuoc Tuy province had influenced Australian military doctrine for decades beyond the conflict itself.